Hi there, I'm the Mythkeeper. Welcome back to my channel. This week I'm doing something a little bit different. I'm not talking about the lore and history of the world of Pathfinder. Instead, I'm talking about real-world lore and history. I'm talking about the real-world lore and history of the Open Gaming License. How did it come to be? What's its history? How did we get here? So all of that I'm going to be talking about today. This is a little bit of a deviation from what I normally do, so if you like it, please let me know in the comments below. I'd really appreciate that. In any case, I think this is some fun content here, a lot to learn, so enjoy it.
The OGL, or Open Gaming License, was originally created in the year 2000 in conjunction with the release of the third edition of Dungeons & Dragons. But to understand why Wizards of the Coast decided to create the OGL, we have to go back a few decades earlier. Let's start with D&D itself. D&D was published in 1974 by Gary Gygax and his friends, and it emerged from a tabletop wargaming system called Chainmail. In fact, the very earliest versions of the game refer back to the Chainmail rules. Chainmail was a game like Warhammer Fantasy Battle, a tabletop skirmish game where armies faced off against each other. D&D broke away from traditional wargaming by giving players control of individual characters instead of commanding an army. The great innovation of the game was in making it collaborative rather than competitive. These characters or heroes would go on fantastic journeys within the fictional world, guided by a dungeon master who would act as the game's arbitrator, narrator, and the embodiment of the non-player characters that inhabited the world. The players, who would make up a group of allied heroes, would interact with the world's inhabitants and each other to overcome challenges, fight battles, discover new places, and obtain wealth and information. Through these experiences, the characters would gain experience points and level up, becoming stronger after each game session. The basics of this have not changed in the last 40 years. In fact, the model of D&D was transformative to gaming in general. D&D is commonly recognized as being not just the first role-playing game in creating the RPG industry, but also deeply influencing video games, especially the role-playing video game genre. However, D&D's early history was not the success story you might think based on its cultural legacy. The first and original edition outdid anyone's expectations, and 1977's Advanced Dungeons & Dragons did even better than the original game. However, as sales began to slip, 1989's Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd edition did little to help keep TSR afloat. There were a few reasons for this, some of which were commercial, and were challenges which TSR needed to reckon with, and others which were contextual to the time. Let's start with the second piece, as it's historically quite interesting. As I just mentioned, D&D rose in popularity towards the end of the 70s. As a whole, the 60s and 70s were a couple decades where new ideologies really took root in the zeitgeist, and by contrast, the 80s were a more conservative era, born out of a backlash to the hippie movements of the previous decades. By the early 80s, a moral panic was sweeping through the US, consisting of many unsubstantiated cases of satanic ritual abuse. This panic spread throughout many parts of the world in the late 1990s, and has persisted frankly all the way to today. This panic originated in 1980 with the publication of Michelle Remembers, a book written by Canadian psychiatrist Lawrence Pasdar and his wife Michelle Smith, which used the discredited practice of recovered memory therapy to make sweeping and lurid claims about satanic ritual abuse involving Smith. Allegations involved a conspiracy of a global satanic cult controlled by the wealthy and powerful world elite, in which children were being abducted and sacrificed. I wish I could say these conspiracies had gone away in the 90s, but they have of course returned to prominence in the modern era in the form of QAnon. In any case, emerging from the satanic panic were several movements against Dungeons & Dragons. In 1985, Patricia Pulling, an anti-occult campaigner from Virginia, joined forces with psychiatrist Thomas Radecki, director of the National Coalition on Television Violence, to create a group called BAD, Bothered About Dungeons & Dragons. Pulling and BAD saw role-playing games generally, and Dungeons & Dragons specifically, as satanic cult recruitment tools, inducing youth to suicide, murder, and satanic ritual abuse. This period even saw a very strange film starring America's beloved Tom Hanks in the lead role called Mazes and Monsters, in which Tom's character suffers from a psychotic break due to playing too much Dungeons & Dragons and confusing his game world with reality. The film was adapted from the novel Mazes and Monsters by Rona Jaffe, and Jaffe had based her 1981 novel on inaccurate newspaper stories about the disappearance of James Dallas Egbert III from Michigan State University in 1979. Early media accounts had overemphasized Egbert's participation in fantasy role-playing, often speculating that this hobby of D&D might have been a factor in his disappearance. In any case, by the 1980s, Dungeons & Dragons had a very bad brand domestically, and many parents were preventing their children from playing the game for fear that it really was a satanic recruitment tool, or alternately fearing that it would lead to psychological problems down the line. Of course, this was only part of the problem. The other problem, and one that D&D still faces today, was more commercial in nature. In wargaming, the hobby from which D&D emerged, the companies who were producing the wargames, including Warhammer in the UK, were making plenty of money selling miniatures and rulebooks, which were required by players to play the game. D&D, however, had, in modern parlance, a monetization problem. For every 6 or 7 players, only one player, typically the GM, really needed to purchase the game. There was no impetus for players to keep investing in the game. Once they owned the core rules, they could play hours of adventures, with little need of anything additional to support them, beyond some dice and their imagination. The bad ecosystem combined with this fundamental monetization problem spelled disaster for TSR. The sales of core rulebooks and box sets reached a peak in 1983, but declined rapidly in the following 2 years due to market saturation. Customers who wanted rulebooks largely had them already. Although there were some successful products like TSR's extensive novel lines, including the very popular Dragonlance series, TSR's financial situation was poor due to high expenses and the assumption that rulebook sales would remain robust. This resulted in multiple rounds of layoffs and cutbacks from 83 to 85. In this period, Kevin Bloom and Brian Bloom, who were presidents of Creative Affairs and president of Operations respectively, secured a $4 million loan from American National Bank to help keep them afloat. The struggle for financing led to boardroom shakeups at the top level. TSR's line of credit was stopped by its bank, and the company was in debt to over $1.5 million. Gygax would later say that he was in the dark as to the extent of the financial difficulties due to being in Hollywood at the time, though most today suspect he likely was informed about what was going on. In any case, Gygax returned to TSR's headquarters in Wisconsin, bought 700 shares of TSR stock, and took 51.1% of the company, up from around 30% before. He had a confrontation with the board of directors, and the Blooms were removed. Despite his efforts, the financial difficulties persisted, and within a year of the Blooms' departure, the company posted a net loss of $1.5 million, resulting in layoffs of approximately 75% of the staff. Gygax sought financing, and he was introduced through a mutual friend to Lorraine Williams. Williams was an American businesswoman who had a good deal of her own money to invest, thanks in part to the fact that she was the heir to the very popular Buck Rogers comic strip and its syndication rights. Williams was given a position as a general manager at TSR and tried to address the company's financial issues, which led to conflicts with Gygax. Despite the fact that Williams would acquire a reputation as a non-gamer and would often be viewed as the villain in retrospectives of TSR, she actually managed to turn around TSR's financial troubles for a time, and as a result, effectively saved Dungeons & Dragons. Today, her tenure has its defenders. John D. Ratliff said, "Every single person I talked to who worked under Gary and the Blooms and then worked under Lorraine preferred working under Lorraine. I never met a single person who was under both who didn't prefer being under her." Jeff Grubb said, "She pretty much saved the company, as the company was weeks away from total collapse when she took over." However, Lorraine Williams' leaner operation and tighter organization was just a lifeline, not a permanent solve for the company's troubles. Despite having total sales of around $40 million in 1995, TSR was struggling financially by the end of 96, with significant debt and low cash reserves. This was due in part to Random House Publishing invoking a contractual clause that allowed them to return a large amount of unsold inventory, along with a fee, leading to a cash crunch for TSR. The company was unable to pay its printing and shipping bills, resulting in a loss of production plates for key products, including the core D&D books. The crisis led to more layoffs and staff departures, and TSR was facing multiple lawsuits due to unpaid debts and missing royalties. Without a viable plan for financial recovery, there was only one thing left to do: sell the company. TSR was eventually sold to Wizards of the Coast in 1997, through a deal brokered by Five Rings Publishing Group. Here, another person enters our story: Vice President of Product Development over at Five Rings, Ryan Dancy. Dancy was one of the key figures who helped negotiate the sale of the property to Wizards of the Coast. He stayed on with Wizards after the deal went through and became the business head of Wizards of the Coast's new role-playing department. Most importantly to our story, he spearheaded the creation of the Open Gaming License. Of course, one of the things that was happening in software at the time was the emergence of Linux in 1991, which ushered in the age of open-source software. Ryan was inspired by this concept and thought it could apply to gaming. In an interview, he stated, "I think there's a very strong business case that can be made for the idea of embracing the ideas at the heart of the open-source movement and finding a place for them in gaming. One of my fundamental arguments is that by pursuing the open gaming concept, Wizards can establish a clear policy on what it will and will not allow people to do with its copyrighted material. Just that alone should spur a huge surge in independent content creation that will feed into the D&D network." It's clear from statements like this that Dancy largely conceived of the open gaming license based on the belief that the true strength of D&D was in its gaming community. There was something else, fundamental to the nature of RPGs, that Dancy understood as well, and this harkens back to my earlier discussion on the monetization problem that Dancy needed to address. Some D&D content would always sell well. The player's handbook, for example, would always be needed by every player at a game table. Other content, however, would always sell less well. For example, adventure paths would only ever be purchased by GMs, so the target audience was cut by 20% for that kind of content. But he knew that somewhere out there, someone would produce that content. That would allow Wizards to focus on producing the best core content they could, but give players access to a vast library of community-generated content, making D&D the #1 role-playing game system in the world. Ryan's vision would prove to be incredibly successful. The 3rd edition of Dungeons & Dragons was the best-selling edition the game ever had. Overnight, the D20 system became the de facto system for all sorts of role-playing, not just D&D either, but other D20 products emerged like D20 Modern and D20 Future, Mutants and Masterminds, and True 20, just to name a few, which allowed players to use the system to play any sort of game they could possibly imagine. Anyone could publish D&D-compatible content using the Open Gaming License, and third-party content exploded, but it all required the core D&D rulebooks to play. Despite the enormous success of 3rd edition, especially given the historic revenue of TSR as a company, executive at Wizards of the Coast's parent company, Hasbro Inc., wanted more from that division. As we will see, this will become a pattern at Wizards, recurring every few years as senior executives don't always understand the challenges of this kind of game, and we're in the middle of something like that today, as we'll get to shortly. Essentially, Wizards has 2 brands. Magic the Gathering, which earned them almost $1.3 billion last year, and Dungeons & Dragons, which earned them between $100 and $150 million last year. Essentially, D&D is pocket change to Magic the Gathering. These two are fundamentally different games, though. One is collectible, and the other basically just requires a book and some dice. That's not to say that D&D is valueless, just that it will always be orders of magnitude smaller than its big brother, as would any RPG product. And these numbers that I've given you are in spite of attempts in recent years to digitize the content and make it subscription-based and so on. These are the highest earnings D&D has ever had, and they still pale in comparison to how much money Magic the Gathering makes. And when senior executives see this difference in earnings, they assume they know the business and start making suggestions. This occurred for the first time in 2008, when D&D released 4th edition of Dungeons & Dragons. Over the previous 8 years, senior executives had grown concerned about the volume of third-party content being sold under the Open Gaming License. Why aren't we making that money, they said to themselves. So, along with the release of the 4th edition, Wizards of the Coast transitioned to a new, more restrictive license called the Game System License, or GSL, which was available for third-party developers to publish products compatible with Dungeons & Dragons 4th edition. GSL was incompatible with the previous OGL. However, Ryan Dancy and the team had been fairly thoughtful in the development of the original OGL, so by its own terms, the OGL was perpetual, and consequently remained in widespread use. In fact, as the superior gaming license, it effectively killed the GSL, and therefore third-party support for 4th edition. The backlash to 4th edition was so strong in that first year that Paizo Publishing produced its first full role-playing game, based on the original Open Gaming License. The Pathfinder role-playing game was published in 2009, and it ate Wizards' lunch. Although sales of the 4th edition core rulebooks remained strong, Pathfinder supplements outsold D&D supplements for the better part of a decade before Wizards had to pivot and rapidly roll out its 5th edition of the game. On January 12, 2016, Wizards of the Coast released the 5th edition SRD under the original version 1.0a of the OGL, marking a return to the open gaming format. Not surprisingly, and you're probably seeing a pattern here already, the 5th edition of Dungeons & Dragons was hugely successful, even eclipsing the success of the 3rd edition at its height. Additionally, content creators could access a different license option by publishing through the Dungeon Masters Guild. These licenses go a step forward by allowing individuals and third-party publishers to create and sell content based on specific Wizards of the Coast intellectual property, such as Forgotten Realms, Ravenloft, Eberron, and the Magic the Gathering Planes. For this type of license, content creators are allowed to set their own price. However, Wizards of the Coast takes a 50% cut of the proceeds. Although that seemed like a good idea in principle, in truth, not many publishers have actually taken advantage of this, as a 50% cut is pretty significant. In spite of this, D&D is doing better than it ever has in its entire history. So why, in early 2023, which is only a few months ago as the date of this publishing, with the upcoming release of 6th edition, dubbed 1D&D, around the corner, did Wizards toy with the idea of editing the open gaming license again? Well, the answer is pretty simple. Our memories are short, and executives are greedy. Every time Paizo sells a book, or a D20-based Kickstarter gets a large amount of funding, an executive at Hasbro has heartburn, and they wonder why aren't they making that money when they own D&D, and so around and around it goes. The 2020s are a pretty different time from the 2010s, as it turns out. A decade makes a big difference. The social media backlash to the leaks were astonishingly quick. Here's a rough timeline. On January 5th, 2023, a new open gaming license was leaked by Gizmodo reporter Lynn Kadega, with plans for it to be officially published in the early part of the month. This license significantly altered details from the existing open gaming license, with provisions for things like royalties, reporting to Wizards of the Coast, and the termination of the current license, under which all third-party products for use with D&D have currently been created. This leak triggered an immediate reaction from fans who saw it as a threat to the community goodwill that Wizards of the Coast had built during 5th edition. Third-party publishers were left in a state of uncertainty, questioning whether they could continue producing products without the current license, or if they could still sell existing products that were on the old license. Some also wondered if, legally, the company even had the authority to end the license. In actual fact, it likely would have been impossible for them to actually terminate the original license. For context, this is a license that only exists in the context of the gaming world. There's no precedent for this in traditional publishing, and it would not be possible to have books actually pulled from bookshelves. For a good insight into the legal ramifications of shifting the OGL, I actually really recommend Legal Eagle's review, link in the description below. He goes in far more detail here than I ever could. Regardless, the community reacted fast. Subscriptions of D&D Beyond were terminated en masse as the media furor grew around this. On January 13th, a mere 8 days after the leak, Wizards put out an apology letter. "It's clear from the reaction that we rolled a 1, said Kyle Brink, executive producer of D&D, on the website. Our plan was always to solicit the input of our community before any update to the OGL. The drafts you've seen were attempting to do just that. We want to always delight fans and create experiences together that everyone loves. We realize we did not do this at this time, and we are sorry for that." Then, on January 27th, 2 weeks later, Kyle Brink posted again, this time rolling back any planned changes to the OGL at all. "The live survey results are clear. You want OGL 1.0A. You want irrevocability. You like Creative Commons. The feedback is in such high volume and its direction is so plain that we're acting now. We're leaving OGL 1.0A in place and also making SRD 5.1 available under a Creative Commons license." It's actually stunning how quickly Wizards reversed course on this, and it speaks to the connectedness of our world right now, how quickly this incident gained media traction and coverage. It also goes to show that Ryan Dancy and his team were right. The strength of D&D has always been its community. The genie is out of the bottle, Wizards. The D20 system is open, and it will likely always remain open. However, if you're watching this, expect this to happen again. In time, this incident, the terrible failure of 4th edition, and so on, will be forgotten, and execs at Hasbro will start to wonder why D&D isn't making that much more money, and why competitors seem to be making a lot of money selling D&D compatible content. But I imagine the next time it will go much the same way this went, pointlessly. There's a final button on this whole affair that's worth mentioning. After the proposed OGL leaks, the third-party developers did not ignore it. On January 19th, only a week after Wizards' first apology, Paizo posted the following to its own community. Over the course of the last week, more than 1,500 tabletop RPG publishers, from household names going back to the dawn of the hobby to single proprietors just starting to figure out their first digital release, have joined together to pledge their support for the development of a universal, system-neutral open license that provides a legal safe harbor for sharing rules mechanics and encourages innovation and collaboration in the tabletop gaming space. The alliance has gathered, work has begun. Paizo is now leading the charge to develop the Open RPG Creative License, or ORC license for short. This license will not be owned by a single entity, the way that Wizards owns the OGL. Rather, it will be held by a legal firm representing the collective interest of these 1,500 companies. In this sense, it actually may work out being a little closer to what Ryan had hoped for when he dreamed up the OGL at the end of the 90s. An open gaming license that is irrevocable to protect all those that use it for their platform. Will the ORC replace the OGL? Maybe. Only time will tell. But for my part, I'm eager to see where all this goes, and what it means for the future of tabletop role-playing in general.
Hopefully that was interesting and informative for all of you. If you enjoyed that, please let me know in the comments below. If you're enjoying what you see in this channel in general, be sure to like and subscribe. It really helps me out. I'll be back to some more regular content next week. I'll see you there.